All right, well, we've heard a couple of the terms already throughout today, and we know that, trends, we are a trendy world. We know that there are all kinds of trends, whether it's fashion or music or vehicles or haircuts, but are there trends in agriculture? Oh, yes, our industry is definitely susceptible to peer pressure and wanting to be on the cutting edge of things as well. So it's time for us today to talk about some of the latest infatuations making the rounds on the farm front. Terms that we're hearing a lot more about, things like regenerative agriculture, soil health, and carbon sequestration. Our next speaker, Dr. Ben Ellert, will look at the origins of these approaches, their validity, and how best to put them to work. Now, Dr. Ellert is a research scientist in biogeochemistry with the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research and Development Centre here in Lethbridge. Now, he earned his PhD in soil science and has a lot of experience in research on the cycling of carbon, nitrogen, and other biogeochemicals in agroecosystems. So he studies these land-atmosphere exchanges of greenhouse gases associated with such cycling and then applies isotopic techniques to trace element flows in the environment, and then gleans insight from assorted long-term field experiments. So his interest, of course, in agriculture stems from his own early years on a small mixed farm right here in southern Alberta. So we're looking forward to her presentation. Go ahead, Dr. Ellert.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for enduring the full day and coming down to this point of the day. This talk, I'm going to try to talk about some of the latest things that we hear a lot about. And the first thing is words. I'm not going to go on like an English teacher or something about etymology, but there's lots of words that we encounter in our work every day. Some of these words may be buzzwords. Some of them may be words to market a product. Some are misleading, deceptive, or even confused. Other words can be cringeworthy even. Some are metaphorical. Others are compelling or engaging to motivate us to look more. But regardless of the words, I think it's apt, the old observation by Confucius, that if names be not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. And in this last talk, we're going to talk about the truth of things. So first of all, a joke a little bit at my expense with one of my favorite words, sustainability. The web cartoonist, Randall Munroe, suggests that the use of the word sustainable is unsustainable, and he knows better than this, but he extrapolates far beyond his data set. So sustainability is a word that's often used. We've heard a lot about sustainable agriculture, and the next big thing is to replace this, and partly because it was co-opted by big ag and industrial agriculture. Now what we're hearing a lot about is regenerative agriculture. What is this about? And it is purported as a new innovative approach to agriculture that tries to restore ecological function. And somewhat ironically, this is a listing of 6 principles of regenerative agriculture. And despite their desire to not have their term co-opted by big ag, this is actually from General Mills. So there's 6 basic principles. One of the unique ones is at your far right is the integration of livestock in the production system. So it's very much an integrated crop livestock production system. Like a lot of the others, the third circle is maximize crop diversity, both temporal diversity and spatial diversity. And then 3 of the other circles are quite related. The orange circle is tillage intensity or soil disturbance. The next one over is keeping the soil covered at all times, presumably that's with dead residues. And the third one is maintaining live roots. In this part of the world, I don't know if these people know about minus 20 days. The root metabolism is pretty slow at those temperatures, and I've measured it, or attempted to. But it's the emphasis on cover cropping. The sixth principle, which I kind of like in this diagram, and a lot of descriptions leave it off, is the one at the far left, is to the importance of understanding the context of the different practices that goes into your system, because a practice developed in the US Midwest where you have 200-day-long growing season might not necessarily fit into southern Alberta, where we're lucky to get 110 days in a lot of years and are dealing with a third as much precip. Where did regenerative agriculture come from? I suspect it came from regenerative biology and medicine. So what's that about? It is the study of how organisms repair and replace missing cells, tissues, and structures. And one of the kings of the organisms of doing this, any guesses? I'm sure Jonathan would know, is the planaria. They're flatworms belonging to the phylum Platyhelminthes, and these are the king of regeneration. You can cut these guys in half, and you grow two worms. You can cut them lengthwise and they grow two worms. They've even got tricks where they can grow two heads on these critters. And there's lots of interest in that for medicine, to repair damaged structures. Our liver, I guess, is the organ that has one of the greatest regenerative capacities. And we use a lot of the strategies, the importance of evidence-based medicine. We want to use similar kinds of strategies in agriculture and agronomy. So that's one place. Another origin of the idea of a regenerative system comes from systems dynamics. And that's actually a computer simulation modeling technique, and it goes back to Jay Forrester at MIT in the 1960s, where they first had computers available to model complex set of differential equations to look at interactions between different components of a system. It could be an ecosystem, it could be an industrial production system, and in fact, they developed models of the global planetary system and how humans interact with resources. And this approach was widely adopted. It influenced Buckminster Fuller and his student Medard Gable. And Medard Gable used a global simulation called World Game to simulate the behavior of the planet. And he observed that he thought sustainability was a very bad strategy, because he says sustainability is a static concept at best. Why sustain a system that's degraded? All it will lead to is a spiral decline downwards. And what Gable wanted is an upward spiral, where you had reinforcing functions to restore the performance of the system. And that was what he was aiming for. And these upward spirals would reinforce each other and improve or regenerate system function. Just another example there is this shows both the downward and the upward spiral in one diagram. I really like the illustration. It's by Jarrett Sitter. I believe he's a graduate of U of L here. And this is, it's like a lot of these alternative agriculture systems. This is a very recent book on permaculture. Don't have a lot of time to go into this. That heavily emphasis on designing systems based on what we see in natural ecosystems, whatever those are in a world with 415 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. But this is an interesting book. The authors are Avis, and Cohn. Dakota Cohn owns a farm in central Alberta, and the artist was Jarrett Sitter. And permaculture, heavily reliant on perennial crops in those systems, and it builds on early ideas, half a century old already, by Sepp Holzer in Europe and Bill Mollison and others from Australia. So moving on, what is distinctive about regenerative agriculture? Now this matrix approach was taken, it's heavily modified from the one presented by Green in the recent issue of the American Society of Agronomy, Soils and Crops magazine. And this shows 6 different systems of alternative agriculture across the top. And then we're looking at the emphasis, or what principles are these different systems pursuing. And for sure, there's a big emphasis on soil health in all of these. And all of, well, maybe a little bit less so in permaculture, all of them emphasize soil carbon. And of course, for me, as a biogeochemist that looks at nutrient cycling, that's an interesting concept. Only some of them emphasize greenhouse gases. So the accumulation of soil carbon isn't necessarily enough to determine your greenhouse gas footprint, right? Because there's other sources. You increase soil carbon, and yes, you can withdraw CO2 from the atmosphere, but it depends on other sources as well. Fossil fuel consumption in the system. If you have grazing livestock, especially ruminants, they eructate methane. If you have a lot of nitrogen cycling, you bleed off inevitably some nitrous oxide in those. So that's one set of factors. Looking at the next group, now this is very similar to those 3 factors, the key principles of regenerative ag, and it pertains to soil coverage and disturbance. Some of these systems purport to minimize tillage. That's an important goal. Less important in organic systems, because that's one of the few strategies you have left to manage pests, especially weeds. They want to keep soil covered. Organic residues, very crucial for protecting our soils against wind erosion, overwinter wind erosion. Jonathan talked about that. Haven't heard about the biocrust yet, but that sounds like a very intriguing approach. And the other thing is to deploy cover crops, and we see a lot of interest in that these days, and that's a key part of regenerative agriculture. The final set of factors are the really differentiating ones, but I guess the more important thing is there's lots of commonalities amongst these. The livestock component is very important in regenerative agriculture. The certification and the shunning of crops with GMO traits is part of organic production. And some of these, they want to restrict the input of synthetic inputs. I kind of recoil at some of the alternative ag things where they bundle together synthetic inputs as all the crop protection chemicals and the inorganic fertilizers. Yes, they're both synthetic inputs. They're fundamentally distinct. And then some systems lean heavily on digital tools. So that's some of what regenerative agriculture is about. If you want to read testimonials and descriptions, there's a number of recent books out there. From the Australian perspective is Call of the Reed Warbler. Gabe Brown near Bismarck, North Dakota. Another one of you may be less familiar with is Stephanie Anderson's One Size Fits None. And that's kind of an interesting one because the subtitle is A Farm Girl in Search for the Promise of Regenerative Agriculture. She tells a story because she grew up on a conventional agricultural farm in South Dakota, and she went all over the states, sort of profiling different farms, including a visit to Gabe Brown's farm as well. So all of these alternative systems of agriculture purport to address the failures of industrial agriculture, and these failures are often categorized as the triple bottom line. The failure of these systems to be economically viable, huge debt loads on conventional farms, the failure of these systems to support vibrant rural communities and economies because of the ever-increasing farm size. The small towns are dying all over North America, and the failure of these systems to protect the environment. So that's what is the motivating factor behind this. I got an opportunity to make a pilgrimage, another metaphor, to Brown's Ranch near Bismarck, North Dakota. In my office, I had farmers come in and visit to me, and they were talking about their visits to Gabe Brown's Ranch, and why weren't we doing this, and what do you know about that? And I didn't really know a lot about it. Gabe Brown was really pushing the idea of soil health. So when the opportunity came in July of 2016, I took the opportunity to visit Gabe Brown. There he is, a real charismatic guy in his Green Bay Packer sweatshirt, telling us all about regenerative agriculture on his ranch. Of course, the key thing with regenerative agriculture, and one of the things that I'm probably most dubious about, not that I'm a big cowboy, is the importance of their grazing practices. And there's been so many different names for this. It's linked to Alan Savory's holistic range management, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, mob grazing, and that sort of thing. But we were learning about that. But his initial emphasis before the book was on soil health. So what is soil health? Soil health is an analogy between human health and the physiological performance of our bodies, something that most of us are intimately familiar with, and that is drawing an analogy between human health and soil health. So that's the big thing. Soil is quite different. Humans are one organism. Soils are a complex ecosystem that includes many and a wide range of animals. But soil health isn't the only thing that the health analogy has been applied to. The health analogy has been ascribed to environment. We talk about environmental health, ecosystem health, rangeland health, aquatic health, and even planetary health. So soil isn't particularly unique in having that applied to it. Early on, the proponents of organic agriculture, they often pointed out the interlinkage of soil health and human health, and even the communities and the landscapes in which they're embedded. One of the concerns about the whole soil health concept is it is a metaphor, really. Okay, the analogies are very useful, and I'm using a lot of them in my communications with you this afternoon to explain concepts and phenomena. It can be restrictive, though, when it is interpreted literally. It can constrain reasoning, and it can contribute to misunderstanding, because it is really difficult. Despite all the sales of soil health tests out there, it's not that easy to put a number on soil health. So getting back to Gabe Brown's ranch, he was stacking enterprises, productive enterprises. After the cattle graze, he brought in these portable chicken houses, and he is raising chickens for their eggs and meat using a dual purpose variety of bird. Direct consumer marketing was a big part of his enterprise. We saw lots of other farms, diverse cover crop after corn that's got some sorghum and some tillage radish. One of the things I had trouble with was there was a lot of emphasis on soil health, but when we got lectured on soil health, we saw these buckets of soil there. And there is the concept of visual health and smelling your soil and inspecting the root channels and that sort of thing. As a soil scientist, for me, recognize that soils vary in 3 dimensions, X, Y, and with depth. It was really hard for me to draw any firm, hard, fast conclusions with this. And of course, with soil health, one of the key features of soil health is soil carbon. And also on that trip to Bismarck, I got to meet this guy. And this is the interior of a school bus that this guy was living in. You can see he's got his piano in there, and there's a wood stove. And I got to, very hospitable gent. And the newspaper article, I believe this was from Oregon in 2012, this bus was serving as his home and his research center. And this is Peter Donovan of the Soil Carbon Coalition. And I would liken him to, another metaphor, the Johnny Appleseed of soil carbon. He spent 10 years on the road sampling soils and then coming back another 5 or 8 years later sampling again. And his question was, would measuring soil carbon change over time provide relevant feedback or guidance to land stewards who are interested in soil health? And he just published sort of a summary on his website of his conclusions last month. So I would encourage you to look that up. Basically, my interpretation is no, not so much. It's too variable. Soil carbon is hard. It's not the same thing as a soil test for fertilizer prescriptions, for example. That's easy. Just ask Ken Greer back there. This is my cartoon of the carbon cycle for an annual crop in southern Alberta. We've got net primary production. This isn't dry matter, this is carbon. 4.5 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. That might be 50 bushels per acre of wheat, maybe, something like that. A portion of that is harvested and exported from the system. Yes, annual crop production of commodity crops is an extractive enterprise on the North American Great Plains. Introducing livestock provides you an opportunity for recycling. This simple carbon cycle, it's an extractive process. Of that 4.5 metric tons of carbon, 3 metric tons go into the soil, and decomposition happens. People don't like to admit that, and this is exactly balanced. My soil carbon stock to a depth of 30 centimeters. A soil carbon stock is meaningless unless you specify soil depth, is 70 metric tons per hectare. This is a little less than 2% organic carbon. The thing I want to point out is that 3 metric tons input is a small number relative to the 70, and even smaller than that, you're only going to change the stock of soil carbon to the extent to which you can have an imbalance between your carbon inputs and outputs. Simple as that. Biogeochemistry is easy. And that places an observational constraint on this. So now, I guess this isn't a metaphor, this is more of a simile my English teacher would have taught me, but this is for Ken Cole's benefit. Measuring the change in soil carbon stock is like measuring the weight of the ship's cat, and every sailing ship had to have a cat to control the vermin. And so it's simple. To measure the weight of the ship cat, all you had to do is take your ship with the cat aboard and measure the weight, maybe the freeboard or how much water it displaced or something. And then you took the cat off the ship, you weighed the ship again, and it's the difference between the two gives you the weight of the cat. You see any problem with that? Is that going to be an easy thing? No matter how much you like your cat, it's not an easy thing. And that's what we're faced with in measuring the temporal change in soil carbon storage. Quantifying soil carbon stocks. I'll go through this pretty quick. I get lots of questions on this. There's a few key features and why it's not the same as soil testing for fertilizer management practices. And one thing for crop consultants and producers looking at their soil tests, I want to emphasize that soil organic carbon is not the same as soil organic matter. The latter cannot be determined with adequate precision. You should not be paying for it. People should not be analyzing it. It generates waste, toxic wastes that are not worth it. Collect soils to at least 50 centimeters. If you have perennial crops and you're looking at the change from annual cropping system to perennial, you probably even need deeper than that. Determine soil organic carbon by elemental microanalysis after carbonate elimination. And it's a good idea to simultaneously measure total nitrogen, not soil test nitrogen, because it's a very useful diagnostic. The other thing is the analytical result from the lab, unlike the amount of inorganic N in your soil, it's not the same as a soil organic carbon stock. You need to place those analytical data back into the field context. And to do that, you need information on profile morphology, bulk density, horizonation, and that sort of thing. Comparisons among soil carbon stocks should be based on equivalent soil mass, so you need to adjust your thicknesses that you're comparing to account for differences in mass. Soil organic carbon stock reflects that balance between plant carbon inputs to and CO2 outputs from the soil, and these eventually and inevitably re-equilibrate. So the period for which you're accumulating carbon is finite. How to measure this? Well, when I've got colleagues as good as John Nielsen and Keshav Singh, they're just going to deliver something equivalent to me, the equivalent of a tricorder, medical instrument used aboard Star Trek Enterprise. No, seriously, there's lots of active research using diffuse reflectance, infrared spectrometry, and a number of other things. But in the interim, the gold standard is collecting soil cores. We need a large diameter volumetric core. A lot of people panic over the need for bulk density data. It's really not that tough. You need to measure the bulk density and analyze the carbon content on the same sample. Our friend the ground squirrel, he churns things up. You can see the carbonate-rich subsoil he's bringing up that complicates things. And this is what we go back to the lab in to analyze carbon content. Need to recognize that there's different forms of carbon. Carbonate is inorganic carbon. It is different reactivity than the organic carbon the plants are putting in. A lot of our soils in southern Alberta, we also have coal and charcoal. So final thoughts. Let's see, I haven't gone over too much time here. Regenerative agriculture, I'm not one of those guys that's going to diss it totally. It may provide a fresh vantage point from which to improve our farming systems. The emphasis is on soil building practices rather than specific targets or certified inputs. Integration of crop and livestock. A lot of times in our present day farms, there's specialization between one or the other. There may be some scope for achieving this through land swapping and collaboration. Finally, the gains in soil carbon are not that easy to realize, and detecting them is even more difficult. So you've got to be aware of those challenges, and Peter Donovan will tell you about that. And finally, just a little bit of outreach on soil health. We're quite excited that we think we're finally going to get our award-winning children's book on soil biodiversity published. One aspect on soil health that I had a hard time arguing and getting this in there is earthworms. This is one of the things, soil health. Earthworms are supposed to give you a nice warm and toasty feeling. Charles Darwin liked them. They're really interesting. They don't belong here, I say. They're an invasive species and a poor index of soil health. So with that, thanks for your attention, and that's my contact information.
Tough getting your weapon here. Maybe you can use this for soil testing, because you can go down quite a ways with it. But this is a custom-made stainless steel shoehorn for presenting for us. Now, before we let Ben go, he's thrown out some really interesting ideas out here. Different way of looking at things, and maybe it's trendy. Have we got some questions? Are there some? All right, I should have known. Go ahead.
Can you kind of overlay your presentation with the long-term tillage rotational study that was done down here? I don't know how long it went from continuous cropping wheat to wheat fallow to, and what impact that had on the soil health compared to what you're talking about here, and the changes in organic matter that may or may not be related to changes in soil carbon.
Yeah, well, sorry, there's lots of interlinkages between those, and that's one of the things, is there being really nothing new under the sun. From that comparison of the different systems of alternative agriculture, you can see lots of commonalities. So when they talk about the importance of integrating livestock production into annual cropping, our long-term systems provide lots of insight to that, because some of those systems include perennial forages. And that's the surest way to accumulate soil carbon stock. And that's also, I don't think people appreciate that enough, so that's where you can get some faulty conclusions drawn. We also know about adding livestock manure, locally recycling things. We gain insight to that. You have to be sensible about these things. I see Monica Benke here. She worked a little bit with our long-term manure plots at the Lethbridge Research Center. The input of manure was entirely unrealistic relative to the productive capacity of that land. And that's the kind of thing that we look at in biogeochemistry. If you take the forage or the fodder that's produced on a piece of ground, you might have enough manure to add that manure maybe once every 5 or 8 years. And so that's a more relevant comparison of a self-contained system. So those are some of the things.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm a little bit confused integrating livestock into land management. And one of the earlier slides, when you had the 6 points, the one on the right was a picture of cattle. And I've been under the impression that we have to stop eating beef to save the world from climate change. So we're being told, stop beef, but you should integrate livestock.
Exactly. You know, that is a very valid question. And right away, you run into those things on sort of the food system and this sort of thing. So that is a very valid point. And I did have that in that matrix where we look at greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why the regenerative system, because you have that livestock there, it isn't that great from a greenhouse gas perspective. And the livestock people, they like to use soil carbon and say, yes, well, I'm leaking a little bit of greenhouse gas from my livestock, but that's no problem. I'm going to solve it by accumulating soil carbon. They do not really fully realize, I'm afraid, that soil carbon sequestration is a finite enterprise. So that's one of the things that we're up against. And the other thing is on the Gabe Brown ranch sort of thing, you know, you look and you pick apart where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from livestock production. We have some people that promote strictly grass-fed livestock, and you're slaughtering animals when they're 2.5 years old. That's the worst possible thing for greenhouse gas emissions. So these are certainly important questions.
So you're saying not all regenerators even agree on systems. Any other questions along that line or any other line that we could myth bust? So was there anything about Gabe Brown's approach or results that you saw that you were impressed with? Like, I mean, you went down with the skeptic's eye, but was there anything that maybe was on the right track, or are you ready to debunk Gabe Brown?
Yeah, I don't think I would debunk Gabe Brown at all. You know, it's the conversation and the learning that's important. And Gabe Brown is an inspirational and a charismatic guy. I'm sure he commands much larger audiences than I do at a lot of his talks. Is much more sought after. So Gabe Brown is very impressive. His system of agriculture, it is incredibly diverse. Okay, he's got multiple production systems. And one of the things I sort of neglected on the talk there, some systems really aim for the greatest possible productivity, the highest yields. In a lot of organic systems, and even Gabe Brown's system, that wasn't his ultimate goal, right? He was satisfied with a smaller yield, but profitability was very important to him. And in his system, he used the direct-to-consumer marketing. So economic viability, he was doing a great job. Environmentally, I think he was doing a pretty good job as well. So I wouldn't necessarily debunk what Gabe Brown was doing. I would question the mob grazing stuff. I still think we need more data on the grazing management, but that's probably for a different discussion.
Yeah, that's right. It's one approach, but I don't think Gabe Brown could feed the world unless we all turned into Gabe Browns and we were able to find some more land to all of us do that. But anyway. Okay, any other questions for Dr. Ellert? All right, well, thank you very much. Let's put our hands together for Dr. Ellert for expanding our minds and helping us think about things in a different way.